Thank you, everybody, for coming out for Loaf. I'm Jay Westerfeld. I'm with the Loaf Historical Society, and I was really excited when I was asked to introduce Professor Hull. The reason for that is I grew up here, and when I was a little guy, if someone had said Dick Hull to me, I'd say, "Who are you talking about?" Oh, the professor. You mean the professor? It's kind of like Gilligan's Island. He was the professor. He was the guy who I could ask questions, and he's really fostered a sense of curiosity in me that really helped me appreciate a lot of things, nature, certainly history, and he brought it all together. But before I talk quickly about that, because Professor Hull, like myself, will always go long. So pack a lunch whenever you go to his amazing talks. I always love them. But I was asked to just go over the meat and potatoes. First, things not to say if Will Smith is, I'm okay there. So, Dr. Hull is an emeritus professor of history at New York University, and she's the official historian for the town of Warwick. Still, he previously served on the board of directors of the Nature Conservancy of New York, the Warwick Conservancy, the Orange County Land Trust, and the Sugarloaf Community Foundation, and the Warwick Historical Society. Dr. Hull has authored 10 books, including Sugarloaf, 1700 to 1997, The Enduring Vision, and People of the Valleys, History of Warwick, 1700 to 2005. He also produced and hosted the 297 episode History Alive show on WTBQ radio. And I cannot imagine producing and hosting 10 of those. That's a feat in and of itself. So I wanted to just say one more time that growing up here in the 60s and 70s, it was a quiet place. Then it got very colorful when the craftspeople came in. And right before that is about when I met Professor Hull. I'm 60, I was probably about 8 or 9, I think, when I first met him. I think so. And I had a few questions about things. He was always really excited to answer them. And I had a strong interest in history from early on. When I was a little kid, a guy named Don Burrell used to look after me for my mom a lot. And then, of course, we had Clark Hulbert here in Sugarloaf, who was kind of a character. But, these guys knew so much about history, but Professor Hull made it interesting and engaging and exciting. And there's a line from a movie that I love. It's a pretty recent movie, one of my favorite movies of all time. And I shared it with Professor Hull the other day, and I'll finish up here. The movie's called Interstellar, and Sir Michael Caine, in one scene, says, I don't fear death. I'm an old physicist. I fear time. And really the role of historians is to sort of resolve the concept of a cultural death, to sort of keep things, to keep a record that we can all see. But to me, and I'm sort of a nobody when it comes to history, a really effective historian, an educator, someone who makes the real difference is someone who can bring it to the present and sort of give us this feeling that we're all a part of history. It's occurring right now, to bring that continuity to us. And when a person can do that, they've really resolved the fear of time itself, I think, too. So I'd like you all to just join with me, the Sugarloaf Historical Society, the Chester Historical Society, the Historical Society of the town of Warwick, Vision Hudson Valley, and especially our primary host, the Orange County Land Trust, in introducing Professor Richard Hull.
I first laid my eyes on Sugarloaf Mountain when I was 8 years old. And my father had just bought a farm up here, a derelict farm, 116 acres, and an old stone house that was really literally falling apart. It was hardly livable. And we came through, and I looked out and I saw that mountain. and it just absolutely amazed me. We went over to the farm. I kind of took a quick look at the farm, and I said, Dad, can we climb that mountain over there? That really looks fascinating. He said, sure, okay, we'll do it. It was a beautiful day. And he said, you know, I was just about your age when I first climbed Sugarloaf Mountain, coming up to visit my relatives in Washingtonville, which was our ancestral place where my family spent many generations. And so up we went that first day in Sugarloaf, up to the top of the mountain. And I looked across this valley, and I was coming from a suburban Bergen County community with dense population and very suburban, Ridgewood, New Jersey, and I'd never seen anything like this. It was just amazing. So that was the beginning of my, if you will, my love affair with Sugarloaf Mountain. And that was in 1949. And I always felt it'd be nice to live here someday. And when I got married, my wife and I bought a house here in Sugarloaf and raised our family here until we built a house over on the farm, which is just on the ridge above us here. It's the oldest working farm actually in Orange County. The house was built in 1700, and we know that for sure because the builder inscribed his initials and the date that it was built, 1700. It's the first European colonial house that was constructed here. So I've really have had a love with the mountain. And as this area began to develop and more and more houses began to be built closer and closer to the hills of Sugarloaf, it began to worry me. And so I started taking a more serious interest in Sugarloaf, not just in its beauty and mystery, but the history of it. What was it? Were other people dazzled by this? And I would like to think that we have a large audience here tonight because many of you have probably climbed Sugarloaf Mountain and have been inspired by it and have been inspired by the beauty of this wonderful county. So I asked myself the question then, as I prepared for this presentation tonight, why are we going to be here tonight? What are we? Why are we interested in Sugarloaf Mountain and in Sugarloaf Hamlet, for that matter, because the two interacted. So I want to talk about that now because we're on the edge. The Orange County Land Trust is in a stage of negotiation, an advanced stage of negotiation, to buy 350 acres of the Sugarloaf Mountain complex, including the old Palmer Farm at the north end and sweeping all the way across to this amazing woodland. And that's why I think we're here today, because we want to save that vista. We want to save the mountain and all that it has to offer, us as well as animal life and plant life and so forth. So we're here today then to preserve what I consider an Orange County treasure, a landmark, a physical landmark in our county. When I mention the Sugarloaf Mountain Complex, I'm talking not only about Sugarloaf Mountain itself, but the two mountains that are on either side. On the south side, Brimstone Mountain, and on the north side, Mine Hill. So I will bring that in as well. Now, many of you might not know that Sugarloaf got its name by a woman developer. She and her husband came here, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment in a little more detail, but they decided that they were going to create a village here, and she looked across and looked at Sugarloaf Mountain, didn't have a name, at least it didn't have an English-speaking name at the time, and she said, you know, that reminds me of the Sugarloaves in stores, because in those days, before granulated sugar, when you bought your cane sugar, you built a mound. You built a mound with a frosty white top, and that reminded her of a loaf of sugar that she would buy in a store for the household. And so she said, well, let's call that Sugarloaf Mountain. And then in time, the other mountain, the smaller one on the south side, Brimstone Mountain, got its name because it was subject to a fair amount of lightning. And every time a lightning storm occurred, there would be this strange smell, this strange odor. Well, that odor was created by the fire of the lightning hitting sulfur, because Brimstone Mountain has a lot of sulfur in it, a high degree of sulfur. So that got its name, Brimstone. And Mine Hill, because in the 1880s there was a great rush to obtain iron. Iron was in tremendous demand, and so they began to subdivide that land. And if you walk up from that direction, you'll still see shafts, little holes here and there. They've begun to fill them up though, because they got to be very dangerous. People would fall into them and so forth. But many of those were dug in the 1880s and 1890s. But they never exploited the land for iron, because again, there was too much sulfur. The iron wasn't a high enough quality to make it profitable. So that iron rush ended in a bust. Okay, so that's the story of that's nomenclature. But I think one of the things that impresses all of us the most is the view shed. The view shed. Sugarloaf has unique features. It's 1,226 feet high. It's a rare baldy. As you know, there's not much growing up there. So it's a rare baldy. There are very few of them in New York State. There are some though. But it offers also a 360-degree panorama of our county. And not just of our county, but when you get up to the top of the mountain, you can look up into Ulster County and the Catskill Mountains. You can look south into the Vernon Valley in Sussex, New Jersey. You can look west and see now High Point and the mountains leading into Pennsylvania. You can look into Sullivan County. And in turn, people living way beyond Sugarloaf Mountain, many of them can open their windows in the morning, as one woman told me in Middletown not long ago, in the little hill above the downtown Middletown. She said, I love it. Every morning I look out that window and I can see Sugarloaf Mountain from my house. And I also, I was reminded of someone who made the same remark years before, who lived in Crawford, New York, and said that they could see, the family could see Sugarloaf Mountain. So Sugarloaf Mountain has been of interest not only just to people in Sugarloaf Hamlet or in the town of Chester, but all over the county. It is a county icon. It is a county icon. And it inspires people. As I said, it inspired me as a boy. This unobstructed, amazing view for miles and miles beyond. Now, I think another reason why we have to be concerned about Sugarloaf Mountain right now is the water. We're all becoming more and more concerned about the quality of water today. There are many communities in Orange County that are suffering from contaminated water, particularly over in the Newburgh area, beyond Stewart Field over there. But many communities are very, very concerned about protecting the quality of their water. Well, let me tell you, the Sugarloaf Mountain Complex provides water for parts of Chester, water flow streams coming down off that area, for developments right here in Sugarloaf, subdivisions here, draw water from that. The water flows into Wickham Lake. It flows across a great wetland and into Wickham Lake. And Wickham Lake provides water for a huge aquifer that runs from there all the way down through the valley into Warwick Village and all the way down into New Jersey. And it all begins right out there, very important. And if that aquifer becomes polluted, it would be so costly, it wouldn't be worth mitigating it, really, say many hydrologists and engineers. But water also flows eastward too. Water flows into, I think it's called Sealy Creek, Sealy Brook, So it provides a source of groundwater for the Monroe area too. And by the way, the water that comes down in this direction feeds into the Otterkill. One of the headwaters of the Otterkill is just beyond us here, just across Kings Highway behind the Hamlet. So this is important. And why does it do that? Because the soils are very shallow up there. There's a lot of shale. Water doesn't percolate. When it rains, it washes off and washes out into the Sugarloaf Valley and the Warwick Valley and so forth. And so we have to look at the soil. There's a lot of shale here. The house, the farmhouse that my dad and mother bought, that 1700 house, it has some of the largest pieces of shale of any stone house in Orange County. And that shale was brought down, according to the legends, from the Sugarloaf area here and carried across 3 miles over to the farm to build that farmhouse in 1700. But also we have to be worried about public access. Public access. More and more houses are being built around this complex. It's almost like being strangled. Subdivisions just this summer, the past few months, 4 or 5 houses have been built on the bypass here. There have been houses going up everywhere. And eventually, you won't be able to climb Sugarloaf. You won't be able to go up to Sugarloaf. There won't be any public property. And you can see signs posted already. This Rock Ridge development, for example, off of Sugarloaf Mountain Road. You drive down that and toward Sugarloaf Mountain, and there's a big sign that said Rock Ridge at Sugarloaf, private community. No trespassing, no biking, no hiking, nothing. This is private property, the entire community. Even the road is a private road. And it won't be long, I can tell you, it won't be long before there won't be any access. You would be breaking the law. In fact, you actually are right now. If you climb the top of Sugarloaf Mountain, you have to pass through some homeowner's property, and you could be arrested for trespass. So what the Land Trust wants to do is they want to provide, among many things, public access. Public access. And to do that, the Land Trust has to buy that land before someone else does. So, and this also raises a question about contiguity, making open space contiguous. Now this is a wonderful opportunity of connecting up with the Goose Pond Mountain State Park, which has, and that's administered by the Palisades Interstate Park Commission. That has now over 2,000 acres. Another 385 acres were just added a few years ago thanks to the Open Space Institute, which is a land private trust that buys land and then either turns it over to the state, sells it to the state, or keeps it on its own. But it enables public access. Public access is guaranteed. The Orange County Land Trust has the Bernberg Preserve just across Route 17, right just beyond the Goose Pond Mountain State Park, and that's 185 acres or so that we acquired a few years ago. And then, of course, there's also the Sterling Forest State Park of over 22,000 acres. And this is all potentially contiguous. This property that we are trying to acquire, this 350 acre tract, will connect up with these other large preserved lands. And so that's important to us too, then. And there's, in the process of a huge long trail being built called the Highlands Trail. That trail, it will run from Connecticut all the way across our area here, past Warwick, and down into New Jersey, and all the way over to the Delaware River. And that is moving ahead very nicely, very quickly, and we've got a lot of people, even in the U.S. Congress, who are working on funding a lot of this. And that trail will be very close to the Sugarloaf complex here too. So that's very important to us as well. Another very important quality about this area is that the only house on the property that we're looking at, the 350 acres, is the former Palmer Farm, which you'll see their beautiful barn. It's on LaRue Road, just a few miles away here, and that property has ponds on it. It's meadowland. We hope that we can find a farmer, maybe a young couple, to come in and acquire that. Well, we might even be willing to sell that if they are interested in keeping it in agriculture. So that is a very attractive thing. That other than that, the 350 acres is pristine. It's natural. There are no buildings on it, no human infrastructure. And that's going to be prized more and more if it survives by stressed people living in densely populated areas. Another thing about the Sugarloaf Mountain Complex is the dazzling array of flora and fauna. Incredible flora and fauna. Eastern red and white pine you'll find there. White ash, of course, unfortunately right now the ash have been hit by a very serious invasive insect. Black walnut, sassafras, silver maples, eastern hemlocks, red cedars, also known, I think, as junipers. It was used in the process of making gin. This area had a lot of distilleries going back even before the American Revolution. And gin was a favorite here, as well as applejack, of course, too, because this was in a very early period, beginning in the early period, a large area for orchards. The climate, the topography, and everything lent itself. In fact, the farm that my parents bought and that my brother farmed was and still is an apple orchard. It's the oldest working farm in Orange County, actually, continuously worked. Not as an orchard before it was a dairy farm, but apples also do grow very well here. You have white spruce, you have red and white oaks, you have black cherry, you have shidebark hickory, sycamores, beech, black locust, flowering dogwood. I could go on and on and on. Just an incredible diversity of trees in this tract of land. And you also have a huge variety of wild flowers, like wild columbine, lady slipper, a native orchid, which is on the New York State endangered list right now. You have American bittersweet. You have wild crabapple. The Native Americans love that. You have a little mountain rhododendron, not much anymore, but it used to grow well there at one time. Bloodroot, and on. I could go on and on with that as well. And birds, at least 40 different species of birds have been sighted over here by ornithologists. Migratory birds, year-round birds nesting over there is just amazing. How many birds. And some are coming back, like I think the bald eagle. This almost disappeared and now it's been sighted as well. So this is a major migratory route and habitat for birds. So you have all these habitats scattered within this complex. Another feature of it is, and that ties in with the beauty, looking at the beauty of it, the viewscape, is recreation. Trails that are already winding their way up to the top of the mountain from the north, from the west, from the east, south. Trails, some of them go back to Native American days, probably. But there are a lot of wonderful trails in the Goose Pond Mountain State Park as well, and of course in Sterling Forest too. And I might say, people say, oh yeah, boy, if that becomes public, you're gonna have garbage and trash. People are gonna drop things on the ground and and really damaged the area on either side of the trail. Well, I'll tell you, we've had excellent experience. We founded the Orange County Land Trust in 1993, and we've got, I don't know, 5,000 or 6,000 acres now, and litter isn't really a serious problem for us. We have stewards, land stewards, who go out every year. For example, we have a contractual relationship with Warwick. Warwick has a lot of preserved farmland through their Purchase and Development Rights program. And we have stewards that go out there under contract with the town of Warwick, thanks to Supervisor Sweeten, checking up on all the properties that we either own or have conservation easements on every year, and filing a report to the board on a status. And I can tell you, it's not a serious problem. And I've talked to people with this Palisades Interstate Park Commission. Goose Pond Mountain State Park is in good shape. And I know that Sterling Forest State Park is too. So that shouldn't be a great concern if you have an organization that are land stewards and know what they're doing. I mean, you should have, obviously, there should be supervision and stewardship over these open spaces. Okay, so the recreational, the trails that you can follow, and when this Highlands Trail is completed, that's going to really be amazing, I think. And you can stop all along the way. The town of Warwick just acquired 68 acres a year ago. The old Coots Camp property on Bowen Road, and a beautiful facility there, and it just is literally a stone's throw, a couple of minutes from the Appalachian Trail. So the positioning of this Sugarloaf Mountain Complex is really ideal. We also have to think of the archaeological potential here too. There have already, going back to the before the French and Indian War, before the 1750s, a man by the name of Clifton came up here to do some surveying for a company that was interested in iron mining, and surveyed this and describes it in detail, describes visiting wigwams, but they were empty wigwams, but I'll explain why they were empty in a moment. But talked about burial grounds. Samuel Eager, in his book on Orange County, the history of Orange County, that he published in 1845, talks about Native Americans in this area. So it's there's no question about it that this has been inhabited not just by birds and flowers and trees, but human beings as well. And who were these people? As we moved close to the colonial era, as we moved through the 1600s, who were these people? They were called the Lenape. The Lenape. And Lenape, they were part of the great Algonquin culture that extends not only across much of this area, but all the way out to the Midwest, out to the Great Lakes, the Algonquin culture, and to the south as well. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Native Americans were related through that culture, and the Lenape were part of that, and they call their area here Lenapehoking, which we think means the land of the original people, the land of the original people. They considered themselves to be the original people, the first people. Well, I hate to say it, but they weren't the first people. They probably came, we don't know exactly when, but they probably came in from the Mississippi River Valley through Ohio and into this area. Maybe, I don't know, where's Jay again? He has a theory about this. Jay Westervelt, but I would say by at least the 1200s, let's say the 13th century AD, 1200s, the Lenape were beginning to settle in this area. And they were an interesting people. Their land, Lenapehoking, was huge in the sense of acreage. I mean, it included peoples who live on Long Island, Native Americans living in Connecticut, living across the river here, upstate New York, as far north as Ulster County, and westward and down into New Jersey. It encompassed a lot of land, and believe me, a lot of people. We have grossly underestimated Native American populations of this land before the Europeans arrived. And they were connected, so it was a very loose confederation. It was not an empire. There wasn't a capital, so to speak. It was a very loose empire, a loose confederation, you might call it. And many, many different totems. In our area here, there is a wolf totem and the turtle totem. And I think that's rather interesting. And their concept of land. Now, they had no notion of private ownership of land. There were no deeds, no surveys being done by professional surveyors. The land to them didn't even belong to them. They said, we don't own this land. This land belongs to our ancestors. We are the stewards of the land. There was not the word for steward, and I don't have it with me, but they considered themselves protectors, stewards of the land. And they were excellent land managers, too. Henry Hudson came up the Hudson River. He saw fires on either side of the Hudson, and he learned that they were controlled fires by the Indians to try to control underbrush and so forth, to keep the land in good shape. And so we had to remember that. There was no mass deforestation either. Even if they wanted to cut down thousands of acres, they'd have a problem because these were obviously Stone Age people. Their tools, their axes were made of stone. And they felled trees either with axes or they would destroy the bark around a tree, and eventually it would die, rot, and fall to the ground. But they did take care of their forests. They were a hunting and gathering people, of course. They were locavores. I'd call them locavores. Most of their food was obtained locally, within a day or two's walk at the most. And they were hunters and gatherers. And they had become, at least by the late 1400s, they had become horticulturals. They were beginning to plant corn and pumpkins and squash in small garden plots. Everything was kind of gender oriented though. The men and the older boys did the hunting. The younger children would do the gathering of berries and fruit and mushrooms and whatever. They would gather them up and put them in baskets. And then what was I going to say? And yes, and the women took care of the gardens. The men would clear the garden, weed it and so forth. But the women would, and fertilize it. And the women would take care of the crops. And then the men and the women together would harvest. And the women tended to do most of the food preparation to be eaten. So it was broken down then, and they had some orchards. They had not a European type of apple; it was more like a cran apple. They were very small, very sweet, but apple trees were growing right here even before the colonial period. Okay, so I think a lot of work needs still to be done by archaeologists. This area is a gold mine, potentially, for studying Native American culture. I strongly believe that this area had densely populated communities. There was one over in Bellevale along the Longhouse Creek. It was huge, very large Native American community by the time the Europeans came in here. There is several large ones here, very large communities out in the Pine Island area, because the Black Dirt area, those wetlands, was filled with beaver, and beaver was prized for many, many reasons, for clothing and other things. And so I kind of jokingly call that the East Hampton of Native America, Native Orange County, because the people who lived out in that area, they had eels. Eels was a delicacy, even over here, but out in Pine Island Way, the eels were everywhere. And they used to trade eels. They'd send them down to what would become New York City and Staten Island, Bayonne, in that area. And of course, and they would exchange their pelts. There was a little, we now believe, an archaeologist recently has been looking at the possibility of a trading center on the north end of Mine Hill over here. So a lot more work can be done. And a lot of young people are getting involved too. The Boy Scouts, the people over the Bruder Hall, school classes and so forth. So there's a growing interest, I think, in doing archaeological work. So that's another reason why we need to save these sites before bulldozers come in and level the ground for housing development or a warehouse or what have you. Okay, now I said that the Lenape called themselves the first people, but there are earlier peoples, what we call Paleo-Indians, or I guess Paleo-Native Americans. These were a very, very ancient population, peoples. We've come to know a lot about them just since the 1960s and 70s, thanks to the Archaeological Association of New York State, and it's been a very active chapter in our area here, and they've done a lot of work on the Duchess Quarry caves, and they go back. Cliff, what are you estimating now?
12,500.
Pardon?
12,500 years before present.
12,500 years. So the Lenape were compared to newcomers, even though they probably intermarried when they began to migrate into this area with these ancient populations, these Paleo-Indian populations. But there's no doubt about it, this area has been inhabited by human beings for a very, very long time. And what was so nice about this situation, at least during the Lenape period and probably earlier, was this wonderful path that went from Danskamer, which is just north of Newburgh in the Balmville area. It came all the way through here and all the way down into New Jersey and over the Delaware to what is now Philadelphia. And these were two important Indian ceremonial gathering places. And so there was a lot of human traffic going back and forth every year between Philly and Danskamer down to Philly, coming right down through Sugarloaf, because King's Highway here, King's Highway, County Highway 13, was built right over the Wawayanda Path and was completed in 1739, built over the Wawayanda Path. So the Native Americans who lived in this area here were not, so insular as you might think. They were doing wide regional trade in lithic pieces, stonework, stone rollwork, but mainly spears and arrowheads that were prized all over the region, all over Algonquin land, not to mention other areas as well eventually. But so that, I think, is something that we can look at in more detail. Okay, now we all know that if you came through here in 1712, 1713, you'd only find the Stats house, our old family house on the ridge here, and you find a house owned by a guy by the name of Christopher Den, and maybe one or two other people of European ancestry. But the Native Americans had been subject, when Europeans began to come into this area, they were in bad shape because they had been subject to several pandemics, smallpox pandemics. These people had no natural immunity to smallpox and measles and diphtheria. These were killers. because these people lived in lodges called, the colonials would call them longhouses. And they were like Quonset huts, like World War II military Quonset huts. And there might be 40 or 50 people living in some of these. And so all you needed was one Native American hunter who had been out hunting or trading with a European in furs, local furs, and would bring smallpox into that house, into that lodge. And not only would he die, but the lodge would become a charnel house, a house of death within a matter of 2 weeks. Probably 90% of the people living there would have died of smallpox or measles, diphtheria, but mainly smallpox. So when the Europeans began coming in here, the Indians were feeling very vulnerable. They had lost large numbers of their population, their loved ones, and their leaders. Their leadership was profoundly affected by these pandemics. And I think we can be much more empathetic about this now with COVID-19, what they might have had to go through. Because they were before that time, they were overall quite healthy people. They ate well. I just gave a talk down in Rockland County at Thanksgiving time, and I put together a Thanksgiving dinner, a lecture dinner, not a real dinner, but I took all the foods that could be obtained from the land right here, put them all together and put together this hypothetical Thanksgiving dinner, because the Indians celebrated Thanksgiving. The Indians, we started celebrating Thanksgiving, I think, in about 1621, was it? Indians have been celebrating Thanksgiving not just once a year, but twice a year, and sometimes even 3 times a year. We're having these big Thanksgiving feasts. And after the feast, they would smoke, and they believed that the smoke would go up, and the ancestors would smell the smoke and convey and establish communications with these guys who were smoking in the smoking lodges. One was down on the old White family farm here, just down the road, and they could tell you stories. Storytelling was extremely important. These were not literate people, of course, and they had storytellers who were famous for conveying, passing on legends and myths and the ethos that governed social arrangements and overall behavior within a given community. And I think this is also a very interesting thing, because people often wonder, what happened to the Indians? Where were they? Read some diaries of the early colonists, the colonial families, and they all say, we came into a wilderness, we came into vacant land. That's because by 1703, when the Wawayanda Patent was signed, probably 90% of the population had died. They were gone. And the leaders, they'd even reach down to women. One of the signers of the Wawayanda Patent was Chukos. And she was a woman. They were, women were now, it was great for women. Now women were beginning to fill positions that men had formerly filled. But they were in a state of trauma. And I hate to say it, but the colonials could take advantage of that weakness, that confusion, that trauma, that demoralization of the populations that they were dealing with, that they were negotiating with. Okay, now let's move forward, because we're running out of time, aren't we? Oh, well, we're okay. Anyway, the colonial. Yeah, there's some laughter here tonight, because I'm a member of what we call the Breakfast Club, and every Friday we meet at the Country Dream over here in Edenville. A bunch of us around the table. We've been doing this for well over a decade now, and when I start speaking, everyone looks at their clock. And the professor, he'll go on and on and on, on and on and on. So they're sensitive to my loquacious, I guess you could call it. Anyway, now let's quickly move into the colonial period. Henry Hudson comes up the Hudson River in 1609. Wow, this is something. Well, he didn't say wow for long, because he realized that wasn't going to be a short route to Asia. But what he saw along the way, he said, God, this valley here has tremendous potential. It's beautiful. And he came up, I think, in autumn time, and the colors were quite dazzling. Well, the Dutch took a great interest in this, of course, and began to settle it in 1624. One of the concentrations of Dutch-speaking peoples was Albany. This became New Netherlands and was ruled by the Dutch. But if you were living here, you wouldn't have known anything about that. You wouldn't have known anything about these people. You might have heard a rumor, hey, you know, some big thing came in across the water and white people came out. Do you think they're our ancestors? They're white, they must be sick or something. They're very pale, and they look gaunt, and their teeth are rotten, they have bad breath, and they, you know, and they've got sores in their arms. I mean, wouldn't you, if you were spending weeks and weeks on the ocean, out vitamin C, some of them had scurvy and so forth. Boy, these poor people, where the hell are they coming from? So, well, they aren't up here, thank God. They're not around here. Oh. Well, soon they did come around here. Soon they discovered Pine Island, the black dirt over there, and all the beavers over there, and the raccoons, and the all kinds of furry features. And the Dutch wanted fur, and the Dutch became traders. But fortunately, they'd come, they'd trade, they'd exchange ironware, because these people were Stone Age people, and iron was a miraculous thing. God, if you have an iron axe, wow, you can take that tree down much faster. Wow, you can skin an animal faster. You can do all kinds of things you couldn't do before. This is a magical metal, and so that this was in great demand. But you know, after the trade was over, they left. Bye, see you next season. So long, and they'd go, and everyone would probably breathe a sigh of relief. Boy, finally got. Boy, that bad breath, I couldn't stand it. They're gone now. We won't have to see them for a number of months now, till the next season. Well, things began to change when the English came in. And the English evicted the Dutch, as you know, and in 1664, the province of New York was established. The province of New York. What the hell is that? Province of New York. Well, it first was what we call a proprietary colony. There's a difference between a royal colony and a proprietary colony. In a proprietary colony, usually in that situation, the governor would give his cronies, his buddies, land for loyalty. And so a lot of patents, they came up with this patent scheme. And you would give a patent, or maybe to make some money on the side, maybe you'd sell some land. So that was how the province of New York got its start very early, letting out patents for land. Land that initially wasn't even surveyed. Can you believe it? While we on the patent, 194,000 acres of land, and it wasn't even surveyed. Wasn't even surveyed. It took in Orange County, it took in Rockland County, it took in much of Sullivan County, parts of Ulster County. It was a huge amount of land, and they did it through this proprietary method until 1685. In 1685, New York became a royal colony. And when it became a royal colony, then government was established in a much more thorough way, and English civil law was being introduced as the English population was growing. But everybody would be subject to English law. Well, the Indians didn't understand that at all. What do you mean? What is this piece of paper? This is the law! And the Indians would say, wait a minute. Does anybody have a pipe? I'm going to do some smoking. Let's ask the ancestors what all this is about. And they would say, our law is based on customary law, the spoken law. No writing, no ink, we don't have quill pens or anything. This whole notion was new. And the notion of private ownership of property? Private? How can any living human being have their ownership over a certain amount of land? Doesn't belong to them, doesn't belong to me, doesn't belong to my community, it belongs to the ancestors. We're just simply stewards. occupiers. And that's another reason why the Indians like to take good care of their land, because they didn't want to alienate their ancestors. So they were always very careful about how they dealt with land, not to spoil it. But here comes all these laws that they were subject to. And then, of course, Orange County. And the county was divided, and this province was divided then up into counties. And Orange County was one of the first counties to be formed. And Orange County actually was set up just before this law actually went into effect. Orange County was declared, it was official in 1683. But, you know, if you came to Sugarloaf at that time and asked Chief Rumbaugh or some of the other people here, the leaders, what few there were by that time, where is Orange County? Damn if I know. Orange County. You don't grow orange trees here. This is Orange County. Of course, Orange County was named in honor of the Prince of Orange, who was a member of the royal family, the Duke of York. And Orange County. What, in a capital? What, you mean they're building some kind of a building, and they're going to have supervisors and so forth? What is this? What's going on here? Who are these people? They dress different than we do. They speak different languages, and they look like us. They have different ideas about the land. This is crazy. And what was really crazier was that the land was no survey. The Wawayanda patent issue wasn't resolved until, what was it, Cliff, 1785?
Yeah.
1785, after the American Revolution. Right up until that time, no one who lived in Orange County and had land and, quote, owned land and had a deed to it had any validity, really. Because the land actually had been surveyed, and the land had to have been surveyed. And a big dispute was occurred, and the case was argued in a little tavern right here in Chester. The building still stands almost architecturally as it was across from Al's Falafel, that lovely building that's unfortunately not in good shape right now. And none other than Alexander Hamilton was up here in Chester for months adjudicating this case. He wasn't the only one, but that just gives you an idea how important this case was. Alexander Hamilton. And the boundary between New Jersey and New York. Who was on that commission? None other than Ben Franklin. I mean, this was important stuff. You know, you had to have a deed. That's what the law says. You got to have it on paper. You got to have signatures and so forth. But the Native Americans, it's crazy. What is this? These people argue. They scream at each other. This is just wild. But the land, the Wawayanda patent was established, and people began to come in here. People from outside, non-Native Americans, began to establish farms. This was a sub-patent out of Wawayanda. This was called the Rutgers-Hoagland patent. And it consisted of what is today Chester and what parts of Warwick, I guess you would say, a little bit of Goshen and so forth. That was the Rutgers, and the Rutgers family were important families. You've heard of Rutgers University. Rutgers were well-known people and respected and had money. But what's so interesting about the patentees, they didn't sign the patent and pay money to the officials up in Albany for it. They were land speculators. They were land speculators who felt that this was rich in iron, and they were right, because by that time they had already discovered huge deposits of high-grade iron right here in what is now Sterling Forest, and over here in what would become the Cheesecloth patent next to the Wawayanda, over in parts of Monroe and Cornwall and so forth. So they said, boy, this is going to be money. They weren't involved in these land purchases to be farmers, to grow food, nothing like that. at first, but things began to change very quickly. That was 1703 with the Warwick patent. By 1714, we began to see people coming up here to farm. They weren't interested in the iron. They wanted to grow livestock and crops and so forth. And you began to see in Warwick and all over the place around 1712, 1714, 1716, family like the Wisners, the Van Duzers, the Wellings, locally in this area, were acquiring land within these patents and beginning to farm. And of course, that meant a lot of land clearance, massive deforestation to transform them into pastures, but it led to walls, stone walls. And you could say to an Indian comes up and says, but I've been hunting on this land all my life, and my ancestors have hunted this land all their lives. And the farmer might say, sorry, but I am using that land now for my cows or my sheep or whatever. And this is private property, I'm sorry, but we paid some money for this and we want to farm it. Well, that's when the Indians really began to see the handwriting on the wall, so to speak. That's when they really began to see, hey, there's not going to be much future for a hunter and a gatherer in this land. There's no longer a future for us. And there was an exodus out of this area. And, we talk about the Great Trail of Tears, the huge exodus that went out from southern United States, what became southern United States, to the west. Well, the same thing happened here. We need some more research on this because it's a very interesting period between 1720, 1721, and 1748. Practically the entire Native American population of Orange County, and of course, Sugarloaf, left. The only people that remained were people who had intermarried, and most of them had intermarried what would become African Americans, people who came here as slaves. And they tended to stay, and their ancestors are still among us today. And you'd be surprised how many people in Orange County today can say, oh yeah, well, my many great-grandfathers, mothers back were actually Lenape from this area. And I've spoken to some of them, and they have many stories to tell that have been passed down, and they remember them. And we're just beginning to appreciate their heritage, their culture. But most of them left. They headed out toward Port Jervis. They crossed the Delaware River. They went into Pennsylvania. They got into the Ohio River Valley. Some settled in the Ohio River Valley, and others continued to move on all the way out to Wisconsin. And then from Wisconsin, they ultimately went south into Oklahoma, to what became a large part of Oklahoma became a large Indian reservation. And there are people in Anadarko, Oklahoma, for example, whose ancestors were right here in Orange County, in Warwick, what is Warwick, Chester, this whole area. And they've been living in a land that you and I really wouldn't want to live in. Very few trees, poor soil. I mean, this was a Garden of Eden compared to what they ended up in Oklahoma. And a few went into Canada as well. A few settled around, across the river from Buffalo, in that area. So it was quite dramatic. So that by the 1750s, there were almost no Indians. And in census, the early census, look at the census of 1830 in Orange County, 1 Indian was counted. So it wasn't genocide. I mean, they weren't driven out by guns. In fact, most of the farmers that came in here were good people. They really were. They were good-meaning people. The only problem is their concept of who owns and controls land was totally different from the concept of the indigenous populations here. Totally at variance. And the Native Americans knew that they could no longer practice the kind of economic activity, livelihood, community sustainability ever again. It was over. It was finished. It was finished. And it was such a dramatic exodus. And yet, there's not a history book that I know of that students read in our area that has anything to do with this period. And yet, go out to Anadarko, Oklahoma, and they'll tell you all about it. They know. They know. Okay, so in 1714, this area became the precinct of Goshen. This was part of Goshen. Goshen was not the capital. I think the capital was in Rockland County in Orange, because Rockland County, was once part of Orange County. It was broken off, and Goshen was our government center here in Orange County, and of course, continues to be. And in 1739, as I said, King's Highway was completed, and that drew even more people into the interior of Orange County. The laying out of King's Highway. And that was when people began to settle here in the Sugarloaf area as well. And by within a decade, there were quite a few, there was a lot of economic activity in this area. There were 3 distilleries, there were 4 taverns, there were coopers who, were the barrel makers for cider barrels and vinegar barrels and so forth. There were shoemakers, barrel makers, leather workers, and blacksmiths and so forth. So we begin to see the development along King's Highway of houses, of businesses, and this is interesting, built to serve the indigenous farming populations that were growing very rapidly, built to serve them. Some of the first general store, which was set up here in 1806, sold tools, sold seed to plant, sold knives and shovels and pickaxes and things that the farmers needed in the area here. And it was also a very key road during the American Revolution. Washington had his headquarters over here in Newburgh, New Windsor, and he and the Continental Army would travel back and forth between here and Philadelphia and other parts south. So we were getting news all the time here. This was a community that was not just local, but they thought globally and nationally. I mean, they were people with wide perspectives. They weren't just a bunch of country bumpkins. They were getting information all the time. Tom Paine's book was read avidly in Baird's Tavern during the American Revolution and radicalized many of the young people here. It was a book that was supporting revolution, of course. Okay, so you would find too the mountain. Let's relate the Hamlet to the mountain a little bit more. They would take the bark from certain types of trees to develop a small tanning business here in Sugarloaf, using the tree bark for leather tanning. They had sheep. This area over here that we're hopefully about to acquire, the land trust, was rocky, not good for dairy, but great for sheep. And so we see a little wool industry developing here in Sugarloaf in a very early period. Wool for blankets and for clothing as well. We saw the geese, lots of geese migrating, and going back to the Native American period and forward into the colonial period and beyond. Geese feathers, which were used in beds, mattresses, and pillows, for example. Flax was growing in the foothills of Sugarloaf Mountain. Rye, corn on the hillsides, and wheat, believe it or not, but this used to be the major wheat producing area of North America, right here in Orange County. We used to export wheat, farmers here exported wheat as far away as the Sultanate of Morocco in Africa, and wheat to Europe. Wheat grows well here, particularly what's so-called winter wheat, and we produced a lot of it. And so you could imagine wheat going across. And George Washington was buying, Continental Army was buying a lot of Chester and Warwick wheat from Chester and Warwick farmers and Blooming Grove farmers, supporting the American Revolution. And what about the American Revolution? That's interesting too. People in this area were very divided about the Revolution. Some called themselves patriots. Others called themselves empire loyalists or Tories. And there were still others who were kind of neutral, mainly the Quakers, but others as well. We can settle our disputes with the British colonial authorities through negotiation, through diplomacy. It may take a little longer, but lives will be saved, property won't be damaged, and so forth. Well, those who were in the middle, their property, there were committees of investigation, and the self-appointed like vigilantes, they go to your house, knock on the door. Are you going to sign this document supporting independence? Well, yeah, but not in a revolutionary way. Sorry, we're confiscating your land. A lot of farms in this area were taken away from the so-called fence sitters. And one of the most distinguished was Hector St. Jean de Clifton, who lived just up the road here and had what was called Pine Hill Farm. He was a very progressive farmer. And he ended up writing a book about what is an American, what makes an American different from an Englishman or an Irishman or a German or an Italian. What happens here? Why are Americans, what kind of an ethos do they have? He was the Alexis de Tocqueville of the Revolutionary War period. His book was published, widely read in 6 different languages. He was well known throughout Europe and, of course, among people here in this country. And he was a farmer just up the road here by Rose Orchards. You know Rose Orchards here, just 100 yards away, just a little further down the road toward Washingtonville. What happened to him? Bye-bye. You don't want to support the revolution? So he had to leave his farm. His wife and one of the children fled to Boston, were taken in by a friend, and he and his son fled to France. He was born, Hector St. Jean de Clifton, by the way, was born in France, in Normandy, and emigrated here to Orange County to what is Blooming Grove, to establish his farm. So it was a time of tremendous dissension, even within families around the dinner table. Fighting going on. Dad wanting peace and diplomacy, and the son saying, "No way, we have to do this by force." And so we have to remember that, because we look at our society right now and we feel we're so polarized now. And but I'm sure Thanksgiving dinners, if any were being held at that time, were not altogether kisses and hugs. So anyway, but we got through that period, and so here we are. We're coming into the last part of the 1700s, and Sugarloaf gets a school in 1791. They have the school. It's right down the road here near Wellsweep Lane, the firehouse. Sugarloaf's first school, 1791. And they were very, very proud of that. And right after the Revolutionary War, towns were incorporated and set up, and Warwick became a town, and Sugarloaf became part of Warwick, and remained part of Warwick, not all of Sugarloaf, but most of it in here, this area. In 1845, became part of Chester, because in 1845, they created a whole new town, Chester. There was always a village of Chester, but there was never a town of Chester. This is the period of the 1790s, a period of town formation with supervisors and boards, town boards and so forth. And so Chester was parts of Monroe, of Warwick, of Goshen, and what, Washingtonville? Blooming Grove were put together to create the town of Chester. So it became part of Chester, and so that was a major change here. Then we come into the 1800s. We see more exploitation of the forest areas around Sugarloaf Mountain here, not only for, as I said very briefly, for iron that didn't work out, but exploitation for alders. What are alders? What do you make ALDERS? Baskets. And alders grew very well along the tributaries, the water flowing down from the mountain. And that basket weaving went on right up until the 1920s and 1930s, but I'll get into that at another time. The evangelism, the Methodists were everywhere suddenly. From 1804, Methodist communities were being established. Sugarloaf was one of the oldest Methodist churches in Orange County. Sugarloaf Methodism began in 1804, and in 1809, the Methodist church here was incorporated, and the present church is beautiful Greek Revival Doric temple architectural building right here in downtown Sugarloaf. Is still an active Methodist church, and that was built in 1853 from wood that was sawn, was taken from the forest around the mountains here, and cut in sawmills. There were several sawmills. The last sawmill just closed here, the LaRose sawmill, only about 2 years ago, and that went back deeply into history. Let's see. Oh, yes. 1849, the most famous sugarloafer in the world was foaled. 1849. The most famous living thing. Everyone knew about the great horse Hamiltonian. Hamiltonian became one of the great studs of the world. Everybody, the Arabs at that time in history, in the 1850s and 60s, wanted to buy from the guy who owned Hamiltonian. Well, Hamiltonian's owner lived right up the road here, near the Banker property, and he thought this horse wasn't going to amount to too much. So he sold it for something like the equivalent of $25 or something to the stable boy, because he was so good, and he kind of said, I'll sell it to you. And so the stable boy took it, and he turned that into one of the greatest breeders of racehorses in the world. And when Mr. Rysdyke died, or when his horse died, he died shortly after. When his horse died, he was worth over $200,000. He became one of the richest people in Orange County based on that horse. That horse studded hundreds of other horses. And that horse was just about a mile from where I'm standing right here, the great Hamiltonian. And everyone wanted horses then. Everyone wanted, one of the earliest racetracks of the 19th century was over here in Goshen, the historic track. Every community had horse races right down their Main Street each year. If they didn't have a track, they would run them like Washingtonville used to have their horse race right down Main Street in Washingtonville. Oh, and then 1862, transformative, the coming of the railroad. The people here desperately wanted a railroad. Now, the Erie Railroad was built and finished through here in the 1840s, 1841, 1842. And everybody wanted to hook into that Erie Railroad. But where are you going to get the money? Well, people around here dug into their pockets and raised the capital right here locally to build a railroad that would go from Gray Court, which is just up the road here in Chester, down the Chester Village area, all the way through for 11 miles down to Warwick. And I'll tell you, this was like Saudi Arabia in the 1980s and 1990s. Farmers suddenly got rich. I mean, really rich. You ever heard of the name Borden? You ever heard of the name? I mean, there were a lot of farmers, and it was in dairy because the railroad enabled the farmers that had cows, milk cows, to milk those cows and get fresh milk into a New York City market that was being flooded by Irish and Italians and Polish people. People of all parts of Europe were emigrating to America in the second half of the 19th century. And the demand was tremendous. And this railroad prosperous and all the people. And look at the old houses here in this area, in all of Orange County. Look at the old houses and get down the basements. And the basements are like this, they're very small. And you say, goodness, this house when it was built probably only had 2 rooms downstairs and a loft on the 2nd floor, and that would be their house. That's right. But boy, after 1862, with the coming of the Warwick Valley Railroad, those farms, they got rich so quick that they didn't have time to expand their cellars. They just built right over tore the house down and built not only over the old cellar, but beyond and beyond and beyond. So all these big houses you see here, large houses, were built during that golden era of dairy, the dairy industry. And we already had a reputation. We already had it. Have you ever heard of the phrase land o' Goshen? Land o' Goshen was a butter that farmers here exported all over the world. As far as New Zealand and Australia, they were buying land o' Goshen butter. And being produced not just in Goshen, but all over Orange County. And so we already had a reputation for butter. But butter spoils quickly. And before railroads, you had no market for fresh milk spoils quickly. So the only dairy product you could sell would be butter. You put it in firkins, send it over to Newburgh, put it on a Hudson River sloop, sails down the river and into New York City markets. But boy, when the railroad, and then we also see the establishment of creameries. One of the first creameries in the lower Hudson River Valley began here. The man by the name of Minard Sutton. He lived just around the corner here, what was Hugh Marius's house, formerly the Conklin House. He started one of the first creameries in Orange County, and within about 10 years, creameries were being set up all over the place, and not just by the Borden family, who lived a little further north of us, but all over this area as well. And that was good too, because it gave employment to people who really weren't the farmers. The farmers that had the cows, milked the cows. The creameries were worked by blue-collar working people, not paid very well. And most of that, by 1900, most of that milk was being sold, interestingly, by then, not just in New York, but in New Jersey, particularly Jersey City. And the railroad was extended. The railroad was extended to meet those new markets. The Warwick Valley Railroad transformed itself into the Lehigh and Hudson River Railroad. But one thing I forgot to mention about wealth generation was coal. Now, coal wasn't here. It was in Pennsylvania. And people in Boston, in that area, desperately needed coal. And they wanted to transport it from Pennsylvania over into Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Maine and that part of the Northeast. So before the railroads, our road right here, Kings Highway, became a major thoroughfare for coal being transported, pulled by oxen, usually 6 to a wagon. Coal was mined in Pennsylvania, brought right across here and right over to the Hudson, across the Hudson and into New England. And we prospered by that too. These what do you call them? Who drive vehicles, not truck drivers, but Teamsters, that's what I'm thinking of. These Teamsters needed food, they needed lodgings. There was a hotel that was built, right across from the Methodist Church. And that building's still there, but that was a notorious, that was Cran's Hotel. And boy, the Teamsters, they loved that hotel. Wild time. They had a big dance hall that was built attached to the building, and it was wild. And they used to drive the Methodist ministers crazy. Because I've studied the history of the church, being a trustee a while back, and I had so much fun reading these stories, and how the minister would literally preach his sermons in warm weather with the front door of the church open, so he could preach to those sinners across the way. Can you hear me? So Sugarloaf was a lively place. These weren't just a bunch of country bumpkins living out here. They knew what was going on, and they had fun. They knew, and they could have a hell of a good time on a Saturday night and be in church by 10 o'clock on the next morning. Okay, so, and there was crime. A terrible act was committed. The first murder for hire in the history of New York State occurred in 1818, right up here on Pines Hill Road, where Pines Hill Road and Hamiltonia Road join, just above us here, 200 yards. Murder for hire, 1818, went to trial, and the papers had been stored for the preparation for the trial, not in the courthouse in Goshen, but for some reason, I don't know, the courthouse in Sussex, in Newton. And just as the trial was about to occur, it was discovered, hey, this guy, he's Abraham Lincoln's, or not Abraham, William Henry Seward's family. Well, William Henry Seward, by that time, was one of the most powerful political figures in New York State. And he said, God, yes, it's true. This is terrible. Well, there was a fire suddenly in the courthouse down in Sussex, and all the papers were burned. All the papers were burned. But the trial was held, and I can't get, it's a long story, but it's interesting. The first murder for hire occurred right here in Sugarloaf. So, everyone here weren't angels. We weren't all angels. Okay, now, all right, that's probably my wife saying, Dick, you're running out of time. See, I told you, it's an affliction that professors have. It's not a good habit, believe me. But I don't have to worry about it now. I taught at NYU for 49 years and retired 8 years ago, thinking I could just do whatever I wanted to. Well, I have to tell you, I still haven't come up with a good definition for retirement, because I'm as busy now as I was when I was full-time teaching history at NYU. I just want to say, as you can see, unfortunately, I only brought you up to about 18 years. We have a ways to go, but I think there'll be a second murder for hire tonight. So what I decided to do, I'm going to take the liberty of giving a talk to the Chester Historical Society and maybe even the Sugarloaf Historical Society on further chapters in this drama. So this spring, I will, will it be this spring, Cliff?
Yes.
I'll do this, and I'll talk about the 20th century. Really very interesting, exciting things happened here in the 1960s especially, but even before. I'll talk to you about the gypsies who used to live here. Just right at the end is Well Sweet Lane, right over here with the old Fulwood farm. I'll talk to you about the African American community. I'll talk to you about the craftsmen and people like Walter Cannon and Jarvis Boone and Peter Lindsay, who were visionaries. And they revived the sleepy little hamlet of Sugarloaf into one of the great craft communities of Richard Logan Thetis and Susan with the theater, and everything just started coming alive in the late 60s and 70s. Even my wife, who was a batik artist, he said, gee, we have to move to Sugarloaf. And that just suited me fine. Gee, that's great. So we bought a little house in Sugarloaf, and Joe had a catering business there for quite a few years. And it was a very interesting time. And now we're going through a different era. We're in a different era brought on in part by the internet and the challenges and threats that the internet has to all kinds of small businesses. But we'll look at that. We'll look at the future. And that gets us right back to where I started, where I'm ending now, is the future of Sugarloaf Mountain and that whole complex over there. Folks, we gotta save it. And we have until May 1st to save it, because the Palmer family have negotiated an option to buy, for us to buy this property. But the option expires on the 1st of May. And we have to raise that money to buy it. And it will be our last chance. I really do feel that. I feel this, we've been working on this off and on, believe it or not, since 1986. When I wrote a letter to the editor of the Warwick Advertiser, saying we got to do something. That was when I was on the board of the Nature Conservancy. I was hoping the Nature Conservancy would take it, but for reasons, really the Nature Conservancy was beginning to go national and international, acquiring properties and easements in Africa and Asia and other parts of the world. And so we kind of got pushed into the back burner status, and because we came very close at that time to acquiring it. But off and on, interest comes back, and then it subsides. But now we have a family, an old family here, prominent family, the Palmers. Andrew Palmer was on our town board. He owned the LP Corporation, the big tanker corporation. You see the LP trucks in Chester. They have, husband and wife have passed away, and the children now are prepared to sell the property. But they like to sell it soon. They don't want to wait forever, because they want closure, for very good reasons and justifiable reasons. But we've got a deadline, and we're moving along very quickly. I must say, we signed this past May, and we're moving ahead, but we still are not totally there. We have a ways to go, and we're trying to turn to the various communities, not just in Chester, Sugarloaf, but as I said, as far out as Crawford and all over. Everyone who has had the pleasure of seeing this incredible mountain and enjoying it possibly as well. So we're working the Orange County Land Trust, which is a private, non-profit organization that has helped to save a lot of farmland in Orange County already. But this is something that we really feel is so important to all of us. It's the symbol of our county and our history and our lore, and we really need your help desperately. And we do have this time limit, and they're going to stick to that, and we have to stick to it. So we're scrambling, and what I'm trying to do is to have talks like this to raise awareness. So there's a method to my madness and bringing you all together. And I'm so pleasantly surprised there's so many people here. I think there are over 100 people here. Not easy to get 100 people out to anything these days. And so I really do appreciate and thank you for this. And I should also thank Walter Popleo. What is it? Paleo. Walter Paleo is now running the theater complex here, and I think he's doing a terrific job. There's activity going on here all the time, all kinds of theatrical productions, and I understand it's doing well. The town, as you know, of Chester, with good vision and foresight, bought this property and this facility. And so and he has waived his fee. I mean, it costs money to obviously to rent space here for meetings and events, and he has graciously offered to waive the fee. So this isn't costing us any money. That's his way. I think we have to thank the town of Chester and the town board and the town fathers for bringing this up and making it all happen. So we owe a great debt to them, and again to the various historical societies, Chester, Sugarloaf, Warwick, for their interest in keeping history alive and relevant to all of us. So thanks for coming tonight. My nephew now has a winery. Two nephews have wineries on our farm, on their farm now, it's their farm. And so we have some wines from the Applewood Winery. And I didn't bring some Applejack, but my other nephew also has a place on his own business on the farm. There's Jonathan with winery and cider, and Peter with Applejack. But that Applejack is tasty, but you could probably start your car with it. Anyway, but we still go out.